Welcome back to another episode of Rewiring Health. So honored to be joined by Dawn Calvinisti. So thank you so much for being here today.
I'm really excited about this conversation.
Yeah, me too. And we connected online. It's like your content just spoke to me and all the struggles that we go through as, perfectionists, people pleasers. And so I can't wait to just hear your perspective, hear, your journey with all that, and just really dive into it deep and how it impacts all of us. So I always love to hear what brought you to where you are today. Like, what was your journey like through perfectionism, people pleasing, procrastination, all that, to now helping people with that?
Yeah, so I think really my background starts just being in a family that was very aware of what other people thought of them and the image that we presented. And so people pleasing was a big part of my life from a very young age. Don't get me wrong, I had a fantastic family growing up. It was just part of our culture and our situation and my parents' work. And so during that time, I learned to really fit in well and do the things that made people like me and happy with me. And I learned that doing more was what generally made people proud of me.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, doing more led to also doing it really well.
Mm-hmm.
So that
Yeah.
perfectionism piece comes in there. And so kind of grew up through that, got married very young. And also because of that, also wanted to please my husband, do what he thought was best. And we eventually ended up divorcing. And I was in a place where I didn't even know who I was because I'd spent so many years being everything for everybody else and not actually knowing what did I like? What were my preferences?
Yeah.
What were things that bothered me? What were my actual values? And so I spent some time just trying to learn who I actually was and growing through, quite a number of years. I remarried, I had some kids,
Mm-hmm.
and started. I was always an entrepreneur from a very young age as a teenager. So started yet another business in my, I guess my early 40s, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And during that time, led a really large team, a lot of other women in growing their businesses, and started to realize that I was very hung up on what did they think of me and was I doing it just right? And if I didn't do it right, was I a hypocrite? And were they going to be looking at me, differently? And so do I have to keep this image of perfection and doing it all and really showing them that like you can go, 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 go and no stopping. And eventually I just thought to myself, like, I cannot sustain this. It's not possible.
Yeah.
And I don't want to be that person that I felt growing up. And so I have to start digging deep on who am I really wanting to please here? What things actually matter? Why is perfectionism so important to me? Can there just be good enough?
Mm-hmm.
And out of all of that, I started to realize I was starting to procrastinate because, of course, if it couldn't be perfect, if I was worried what someone would think, then I'd avoid it or not do it or put it off. And as I learned and grew and, changed my own way of seeing things, I realized there were tons of other women that I was leading that were in the same situation, grew up in similar situations, pressure from society, all of that. And I was learning answers that I could teach that out. And so over the last about 8 years now, I have just really moved into coaching entrepreneurial women who are looking to remove that piece of people pleasing and perfectionism and procrastination in order to get out of this stuck feeling and break through. And out of that came my podcast as well.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So much as you're speaking, I'm like, you're speaking to me like that. I'm like, oh my gosh, literally so many parallels to what I've experienced and so many women I've worked with have experienced. It's one thing that really stuck out to me with what you're saying is like that feeling of feeling lost. Like you do all these things, you go on autopilot, you're trying to do things for everybody else, and then you lose yourself in the process. And it's such a process to figure out who you are again. And then it's like, right when you think you know who you are, it's like you start to uncover more layers and realize that you still have more vulnerability to share. And it's like an evolution of really discovering yourself again. And I, thank you for sharing your journey, because it just, for anyone listening, it's so relatable as you're speaking, because there's so many aspects of it that you don't even realize are contributing to that mindset. And then we normalize it, especially when we live most of our life thinking that things have to be perfect, or we're procrastinating. We think that there's something wrong with us, but it's really those limiting beliefs that are contributing to it, and so many things. So it's absolutely amazing that, to hear your evolution of where you were and now you are, and helping people uncover those aspects of themselves. What were, as far as being able to like tap into who you were and start to really dive into those limiting beliefs, how did you start to do that? Because that's a really hard thing when we live with these stories that we think are literally true and we take it as gospel. Like, how did you start to peel back the layers to understand yourself better?
Right. I think you're right. Like there's these things that we just totally think this is absolute fact and we never question it. And I think for me, as I was starting to learn about myself, one of the things that kept creeping up was anxiety. And so anxiety would come out and come out. And I kept thinking, like, this doesn't make sense. Like, I'm not worried. I'm actually anxious about nothing. And yet that feeling of panic and all of that I was diagnosed with it. So it was something that was really starting to become crippling. And I realized a lot of the anxious thoughts were around either perfectionism, like doing it just right. And if I didn't do something right, I felt guilty or embarrassed, or like maybe I'd let somebody down. And then it would go to people pleasing. Like, what do they think of me? What if they knew this about me? What if they knew I didn't do this right? What if they knew I actually was, said this, but I did that? Like, so really just not feeling in my own skin that I could really be myself and that people would like me for who I was. And I think that was the second part of the uncovering, because I knew what I was dealing with, but I didn't really realize how much my own self-worth was tied up in what others thought and really wasn't about me being okay with me. And so I think that was the start of being able to say, okay, where do I go with this? Do I need some therapy? Do I need some counseling? Do I need to unpack some of this? Do I need to have conversations with people from my past that I actually just didn't close out relationships well because, again, I would avoid? And so do I need to go back and just make some amends there? And so a lot of that was part of the process of making those changes. But I think the number one thing that was the biggest change, and what I tend to tell women now, is if you can get really, really clear on what is it that you want, like right now, today, not like 10 years, not the dream life, not that thing, but what's the thing that you want right now? Do you want to wake up each morning and feel really excited about getting up and going to work, or getting up and being a mom, or whatever that thing is? Do you want to make more money right now? Is that really your thing right now? Or is it that you want to be able to go and work out? Like, what is the thing that just, it can be a small thing. What do you want right now? And why do you want it? And is it for you? And so once you can uncover one small thing that really is specifically for you, I think that's where you start, because then you can start saying, okay, I do like this. I do feel like this is my thing. It is worth it for me to spend this time. It's okay if I have to say no to somebody else, because this is so important to me. And so once we start being able to say, yes, this is my boundary, this is the limit, this is where I can say, yeah, this is worth spending time on myself, then all the other things, the self-care, the worthiness, the putting boundaries, to be able to say no in a nice way, just start to come and line up. But you need to find one thing that you really, really feel that way about right now.
Yeah, that's such a great tip, and such something that's so tangible, because often you hear like, oh, well, what's your dream life? What do you want to be like? And it can feel so overwhelming, especially to someone who's a perfectionist. Like, I can't picture how everything needs to be perfectly 20 years from now? So it's like to look in this moment and really tap into your core values, like what's meaningful. Like, what a great tip for someone who's struggling right now and feels like they're like getting thrown around. It's almost like a ship without a rudder. It's like the waves are just pushing you in every direction. It's like what the external world does to you. And it's like, if you can figure out where you want to go, now you have some direction to dictate, the decisions that you make in life. So I love that. And just going back to what you were saying earlier, and how you were showing the world one thing, yet you were feeling something in there, and that does, I've experienced that myself too. It's like you still have that front where you have that like protective mode, like I know this is really me, but I can't show the world because it's too vulnerable. And then the bigger that gap is, the more turmoil that you experience. And I find that that's where a lot of that anxiety comes from, where it's like you can't even be one with who you are and feel like you can show the world that true self. Absolutely. I know you talked about, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say the other thing too, that when you're in that place where you don't really feel aligned with your own values, for a lot of women, I find when I'm working with them, they'll even say like, I don't have a dream, or I don't have something that I really want, or, you know, I used to, but I've kind of given that up because I'm taking care of others, or because I'm doing these other things. And again, sometimes it's just literally sitting down and
Yeah.
saying, okay, but if I
Mhm.
didn't have any of those other obligations, if I really, nobody needed me,
Yeah.
what is that thing that I personally would do on a daily basis? Again, even if it's something small, because I just like to. And so sometimes it's going back to that, because we often can't get outside of our present situation to be able to say, okay, who am I and what do I want?
Yeah, that's such it's so relatable because I remember moments having like that, like I don't even know what's meaningful to me. And it's like I love that it sounds like you hold space for women to really dive into that, because sometimes you can get into your own life, and if you don't have someone to really give you those questions and really target the things that could matter to you, it can be really hard to do that on your own. So I love that you give women space to figure that, uncover that, and discover what they're really meant to be here for. So I absolutely love that. And one thing I want to hear your perspective on, and I know you touched on it, was boundaries. And this is sometimes so cringy to like a people pleaser where you're like, yeah, it sounds great, but how do I do this? And you know, oftentimes it makes you feel like you have to push people out of your life. And it's like, especially as a people pleaser, the last thing you want to do is disappoint people. And it can be really like this push pull of what you feel like you need to do, but what you actually can do. So how do you suggest to women on how to navigate boundaries and really implement those?
Yeah, and boundaries are so cool, because once you actually start practicing them, you realize how much freedom they give you. But I think you're right. We often think it means that we're saying no to everybody, or we're going to disappoint everybody. And the truth is, when you find something, so I'm just going to give a tangible example. So, for example, say somebody has asked you to do something for them specifically, like, can you come and make this thing for this engagement, or can you do this, come to the school and do this on this day because the kids are doing this in class, or whatever. But it's something that you feel slightly obligated because you're involved in it in some extent. And so normally you would just say yes. And maybe you would feel a little bit resentful because you didn't have the time for it, or whatever,
Yeah.
but you would normally say yes. And I think part of what happens is, because we don't know what is of value to us, we then don't know what to say no to. And so one of the things that has to happen before you ever start setting up boundaries is you have to be able to fill your calendar so that you actually know what you can say yes and no to, because you can see your time. And I know a lot of people don't want to have things down on paper. Some people don't like looking at a schedule and all that. But when you're learning how to function, sometimes you have to start with something and then you can start weaning off later. But one thing I always suggest is lay out your calendar for the week with everything that you do, whether it's obligations that you want to do or not. Put it all in there. So even things like if you have to drive somewhere to do something, put that in there so that time block is there. We're not forgetting the actual time it takes to get to the things that we're doing. And then once you actually see everything in there, you can take a look and say, okay, where is spare time? Is there spare time? Is
Mhm.
there areas in there that I actually have, space for? And then you can say, okay, well, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I am booked out. It's not that every moment I'm running, but there's really not much free time. And if I book any more time, I will be exhausted and grumpy. I won't be good for my family, my partner, myself. I will be a mess. And then I'll take all weekend to recover, which is not how I want to spend my weekend. So, okay, so what does that look like? Okay, so Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, anybody that asks me for anything, my answer is, I'm sorry, I'm fully booked on those days. Right.
Mhm.
But maybe you do want to do something and you know that Tuesday is a good day. Then you can say, is there a way we can work around that for Tuesday? Right. So then you have an option. You can say no, or you can give another option. But if we don't know our own commitments, we just keep overcommitting because people pleasers want to help everyone.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Totally. And I love that. It's so actionable and tangible. And I just love that. It's something that anyone can do. And especially as a people pleaser, it can feel so much like, oh, I can take it on. I'm fine. I'm fine. I can take on more. I can spread myself thinner. But when you see it on a calendar, it does make it more objective and concrete, that you're not just saying no because for the sake of saying no, you're saying no because it's actually real. And it's like the evidence that your brain is craving. Yeah, I love that. Such a great tip. And it's just, again, something so easy to implement. And yet I believe it would make such a huge difference. So I love that. And one thing as you're talking, it just came into my head, because again, that people pleaser, perfectionist, one thing that, often you experience is that like shame and guilt around everything. Like that's like the default emotion that people pleaser perfectionists tend to get into. It's like, even if something's good, there's, if someone does something nice for you, there's almost still that like shame and guilt they experience with it. So how do you recommend for women to start to move out of that shame guilt and not always constantly get thrown back in it in their life?
Yeah. So this one, I'm going to back up a little bit,
Yeah.
because always the shame and guilt comes from conversations in our own head, right? So I've named my inner critic. So her name's Harriet. And that's who she is. And so I recognize her when she speaks up, and shame and guilt, again, comes with some voice. And so maybe it's that you didn't do something to the degree that you think you should have, perfect enough. And so you're telling yourself like, you should have done better. You should have spent more time. That's something that, better than to just put that out like that. What if what if people don't like it? And now it's because you didn't bother, whatever. So these voices go, and that's my Harriet. And so I'll just say, yeah, Harriet, yeah, Harriet, I recognize you. And I understand that you're worried. And I understand that you're afraid what people are going to think of you. But you know what? We're good enough, and we don't need to keep looking for other people to validate us. So we're happy with it. That made our life more easy to do it like that. We're going to let it go. So for me, a lot of times the shame and guilt is a conversation with my inner critic. And that is still a work in progress. I mean, I think we all have voices, right? We all have voices that tell us we're not good enough. It's not good enough. We're not capable. We're not, that person is thinking something about us when we have no idea what they're thinking. And I think for me, it's really having a conversation with the voices and being able to say, like, I hear you. I recognize you. I see that scared little girl that grew up with that kind of feeling. Often the voices are voices of people that we grew up with, right? Our parents, our grandma, a teacher, but somebody that we valued. And it was, they were probably trying to do their best for us, but at the same time, we took it from such a critical perspective and never really grew out of it. So sometimes it's just coaching yourself to grow up, right?
Yeah.
To mature in those areas and having those conversations with yourself.
Yeah, I love that. And it's so true, because when you're in the thick of it, you think everything that's going in your head is true. And like that's crazy. And I think it was such a big wake-up call for me. And like, when you realize that it's not true, like I don't have to listen to that, like, and to even question that. And I just love that you gave your inner voice a name, because it helps you remove yourself from it, where it's not so much like you're in your head. It's like, okay, now you're talking that voice and you can question it. And I just love that. And that's such a huge thing for moving forward, where you can start to like not get trapped into that cycle. And I also like that you said that it's ongoing process, because I think sometimes people, and like, this is what I've realized, is like you can go back a little bit, but then you got to keep pushing forward. And one thing I love to hear you talk on this, it's like when we have big things happen in our life, like big stressors and things that feel just like catastrophic, have you noticed with people you work with or yourself, that you tend to go back to some of those limiting beliefs a little bit more? You tend to go back to like your baseline. Can you talk on that a little bit, like your experience, maybe with yourself or someone you've worked with?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in coaching, I see that all the time with myself. I see it. I think it's super common. You're right. Because again, every time that stress comes in, right away, our default is to go to the thing we're most comfortable. And generally it's the thing we've practiced for the most years, which is that inner critic that tends to show up, or that belief system that we've believed for decades. And we're only now unraveling it for maybe 2, 5, 6 years. And so our default is to be like, oh, okay, I go back to this because that's what I know. And the reality is to be able to say to yourself in those moments, and again, this is not easy. I just want to say that it's not easy, but the first thing in all of this is to recognize when it happens, because without that recognition, you really can't make the change. And so starting to be aware of what are you saying to yourself? Is what you're saying to yourself true? Like you were saying, asking yourself, how do I know that's real? Right? How do I know that that's actually truth? Could it possibly be untrue? And what could tell me that this is not true? Do I have, anything to substantiate that with, right, from the past, either to prove it true or to prove it false? And starting to be able to work through that. And some of this is, deep inner work that you are working through for weeks, months, years, and it's, almost a continuous thing if it's something that you're running up against constantly. Other things, it might only take you, a few weeks because you recognized it, you caught it, and you're able to quickly move forward and release it. It really depends on your personality. And that's where I feel like perfectionists struggle more, because of the desire to get it right. And there is no right when it comes to growing and self-care. There's only what's right for you. And I think when you don't have a black and white as a perfectionist, you're like, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. I'm lost.
So true.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's finding what's right for you.
Yeah, it's so true. And such a great point, because it is like there's that comparison trap of like, oh, well, they were able to do better in a year. Like, what's wrong with me? And it's so easy to get stuck in those traps of comparison. And then we get into criticism, and then we complain, and then it's like we're back to where we were. So thank you for sharing that, because it's so true. And I also love that you said it's not easy, because I agree. My experience, it's not easy, and there's setbacks, there's movements forward. It's like it's a constant just awareness you have to have with it. And just with that, do you mind sharing a transformation, like either with yourself or someone you've worked with, where they were deeply in that perfectionist, people pleasing, procrastination mindset, and now have released themselves, at least mostly from it or partially, and now their life has changed because of that? Like, if you could just share a story about that.
Yeah, I have a lovely client that I've worked with for years, and it was a slow process, I think, both for her and for me. But again, just coming from a very deep-rooted belief that unless she did everything for everybody else, she would not be loved and accepted. And so that was kind of the deep belief that was ground in there from childhood, growing up. And so what we were finding was, when it came to setting boundaries, and again, because I work with entrepreneurs, she's building her own business, she was really struggling with not taking on everything for her business, because of course she could do it better than everybody. And at the same time, worried that if she didn't do it and she turned it over to somebody else, which would make her life easier, that her clients would then be disappointed because she personally didn't give her own detailed attention to it. And so that was a really rough thing, because again, the people pleasing's there, and the perfectionism's there, and then the procrastination would kick in. So she just wouldn't make a decision, and things wouldn't get done. And then people were upset. And so then she's kicking herself and sending herself back into the cycle. I'm not good enough. And, I need to do more for everybody, and I need to do it better. So that tends to be the spiral that comes out of it. But the awesome thing was, as we were working through, just again, recognition, first of all, starting to create, what do you want your business to look like? What do you want to feel like on a daily basis? I am not about hustle culture. So my clients really, especially perfectionists, have a hard time adjusting to the idea that you can actually do less and get more done by focusing concentrated time, and doing it to the best of your ability, and then letting go. So that's kind of where I come from as far as my philosophy. So to help her start to recognize that, as she was letting go of just some small things that she really didn't enjoy doing, and handing it over to somebody else to take care of for her, and not micromanaging it. So again, another hard thing as a perfectionist, but just letting it go, getting it back, and taking a look through, making any final changes she wanted, and putting it out without major tweaks, without thinking it through too much, just putting it out. And so we made it kind of a plan for 2 months, that this is how we would work this part of her business. And no matter what came back, we were going to talk over what was the difference? What was the difference in the email openings? What was the difference in the response that she was getting from clients? What was the difference in how she felt on a daily basis? And so a lot of that we had to work through, like, let's actually put down on paper, what are the pros of doing that, and what were the cons of doing that? And over those 2 months, it was so nice to watch her realize that all these things that she thought she had to handle, there was no difference in the responses. There was no like, oh, suddenly this isn't you, so, I don't like you as much. There was no, oh, this isn't looking as good. So she started to be able to relax in her business, take a little more time for herself and her family, started understanding that she's not the only one that can do what she does. And she's very capable of teaching it out to somebody else to help. And so all of that made such a big difference that now when we talk, it's so funny, because her first comment is often, you know what I'm going to try? And I don't think she ever offered to try something before, because she had to know exactly perfectly that this was going to work before she would just do it. And so it's been really interesting watching that progression of, I'm willing to try stuff, even if it's not perfect, and put it out there. And it doesn't have to be me hands-on all the time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. Cause it's just so amazing to see when you're like, you realize how much it's holding you back. And like the fact that there was evidence that literally just by her surrendering some of these limiting beliefs, by relinquishing some of that control and power onto somebody else to keep moving the mission forward, it still all works. It's like, it's that fear of like the unknown, but yet we don't have, it's either you have to move in fear or faith. And it's like learning how to move with faith, that we don't know the end result of anything, but yet we tend to move in fear. And so I love that she's starting to like move into that faith and things work out just as well or better. I mean, that's amazing. I
And I
absolutely
think for
love
most high performers
that.
have a big mission, right? They have a big
Yeah.
goal, and they want to affect a lot of people and have major influence. But the
Yeah.
reality is, every time that we take that back and try to control it all ourselves, we limit how much influence we can have, because if we can't actually grow,
Mhm.
we can't have it. And so I think it's really interesting, again, just going back to, but is that true? But is that true?
Mhm.
But is that
Yeah.
true?
Yep. Yeah. And it's like you need these constant reminders. Like even if you're in like a good place, it's like always good to hear that. Like I find myself too, I need constant reminders of like, okay, go back to that, go back to questioning, like don't ever take anything as gospel, like keep questioning those things. And then it almost like releases another layer where you can keep moving forward. So I love that. One thing too is like as you're speaking, like this is me, for a while this was me and your client in the beginning, like where you feel like you have to take on everything and that there's no give, like you just have to be perfect, you're juggling 10 balls and you can never let one drop. Have you seen in many of your clients or maybe yourself like where that starts impacting your health and you start experiencing physical symptoms from that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number one thing that I see often when clients first come in,
Mhm.
it's their sleep. Like their
Yeah.
sleep has been so uprooted. They're waking up in the night multiple times. They can't get back to sleep. They're thinking through what they should be doing, what they didn't do, what needs to happen, what they should have changed. And I think that's super common, especially in women, because we do tend to wait. Like we push all day long and then we go to bed. And so our brain is just waiting to have downtime, right? To be
Yeah.
able to process. And I think as soon as we affect our sleep, I mean, this, we affect everything. Like there's no
Really.
area of our health that is not affected, whether mental, emotional, physical, it's all affected.
Mhm.
Our relationships with others are affected because we're just not the greatest person to be around when we're not
Yeah.
sleeping. And I think some of the people I've coached end up with chronic illnesses that really can be traced back to the fact that the amount of pressure and stress that they put on themselves, and just not recognizing that they were heading to burnout,
Yeah.
was the thing that brought them to talking to me. And I
Yeah.
think when we're so stuck with the fact that we need to do it all, we really forget about all of the self-care. And I don't mean like I mean, bubble baths are great, but I don't mean like bubble baths in the tub. I mean literally just having time to breathe, to look outside, to just change our mindset a little bit, to get a moment to relax and look at something different than whatever is presently in front of us. Whether you are an entrepreneur or not, you could be a mom, and if you feel like you have to go from morning to night and you don't take those times out to have a cup of tea, to read a book for 5 minutes,
Mhm.
to go walk down the road and back, like just
Yeah.
that little bit of relief, we're heading for something that is inevitable. I think when we don't really pay attention to the fact that we aren't giving ourselves a bit of relief and breaks throughout the day.
100%. And I know especially entrepreneurs, it's longevity. This is it's a marathon. So if you're not giving yourself that, you're literally going to push yourself to the end if you don't allow yourself to have some release as you go through the process. So yeah, 100%. For someone who's listening today and they're like, yes, that's me. I'm a perfectionist. Like I can't relinquish control. Like, nothing's ever good enough. Like if it's hitting them and they really haven't even started to unravel anything, where would you recommend them just doing something today, starting? What's the smallest thing they could do to move themselves forward in this moment?
Yeah, I think number one is write down what your ideal day would look like if you had no obligations, like no
Mhm.
obligations at all. And that might be really hard to do if you don't know yourself.
Mhm.
So, give yourself some grace if you're sitting there going, I don't know. I don't even know if I like reading. I don't know if I like a walk, but just literally sitting there and thinking, if I could just plan out an ideal day and nobody was around me asking anything of me, what would that look like? Because I think once we start seeing things on paper that spark that bit of joy, then we can start saying, okay, but why? Like, so if I choose to go for a walk, for example, over reading a book, what is it about walking that I like? Is it that I like being outside? Is it that I like fresh air? Is it that I like looking around at nature? Is it that I like going out for a walk on the city streets? Is it the hustle and bustle of people around me? What is it that gives me that spark of joy? And then how can I start putting more of that into my life? Because that might not be the only way that you can get that in your day. And I think that's the easiest. It's hard, but it's the easiest place to start, is just what would I do with no obligations? Because all of us who are high performers, who are people pleasers, who are perfectionists, always feel like we have to be doing more for somebody else or for ourselves or for our vision, whatever it is. And often it's hard to just draw back and say, okay, but if I totally removed everything in my life, what would I choose to put back in just for me? And I think that's a really good place to start.
Yeah, I love that. And it gives you that gift of having a different lens in your life and different perspective. And that's such a great, again, tangible, something actionable that you can do and really kind of work on, and something you could do every day and ask yourself that question. And it's like, once you get the ball rolling, things open up and you see more and more. It's just like a big boulder. It's really hard to get started, but once you get going, you gain momentum. So I just love it. And thank you for sharing such a actionable tip for people who are listening and feel maybe lost, but now have something that they can do right now in this moment to move themselves forward. So thank you. And for anyone who want to connect with you, dive in deeper, how can they connect with you, get in contact with you, and also listen to your podcast?
Yeah, so the easiest way just to find everything is to go to my website, which is pursueprogress.com. And you can find my podcast there, but it is on all podcast platforms as well. It's Imperfection in Progress podcast. And really, there's also a really great clarity workbook there on the site that's free. And it helps you do those steps where you're literally trying to find, where am I at the core, so that I can figure out what do I want to continue moving forward with. So it's an easy thing to grab.
Oh, love that. And I'll put the links for anyone who's listening to all that in the show notes. So definitely check that out. Connect with Dawn. And thank you so much for your insight, wealth of knowledge, and everything that you've contributed today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Kelly. I love what you're doing. I love the audience that you're reaching out to. So thanks for doing this.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much. And again, for anyone who's listening, please subscribe to the podcast and share this episode. You know, if this resonates with you, you know, you're not alone. There are so many women who need to hear these messages. And if you took just one little golden nugget from it, you have no idea how big of a catalyst that can be to move yourself forward. So again, give yourself some grace, share this episode. And again, thank you all for being here and part of this community.